been rotten, maybe you've forgotten to listen to a tree lady talk.
And we're back. It's really exciting to be back, actually, because this week we are going across the pond interviewing Naomi Zurcher from New York.
Originally from New York, latterly in Switzerland, doing some great work with iTree. But I really wanted to get to know Naomi because I first met her at a Women in Arb coffee morning through the Abura Cultural Association, and I thought, that lady's got a great career.
And boy, does she have a great career. She was an activist. It's like listening to somebody speaking in front of a fire, telling you a bedtime story. I'm really looking forward to hearing it.
A really important lessons to be learned about citizen science, about enabling the local community to spot Asian longhorn beetles to help with the fight of that. Hello, this is Tree Lady Talks, and I'm Sharon Durdant-Hollenby. All music and production is by Noel Durdant-Hollenby, and all views expressed by me or the interviewees are entirely personal.
First of all, Sharon asked Naomi to tell us a little bit about herself.
My formative years, starting at 3 years old, they were as a dancer. And my parents were music people, not professionally, but loving music. And my father recognized early on that I had an affinity for dance. My mother's great aunt taught Pavlova. So there is a real history in the family of dance. And I studied dance and worked professionally from 3 years on till I was about 18. I grew up in the Bronx in a very poor immigrant community. Everybody was off some boat from somewhere, which gave us a lot of common ground. This is what New York excels at. This cultural diversity, this cultural soup, if you will. And that also contributed a lot to an artistic bent in my formative years. I went to the High School of Music and Art, but nature, coming from this kind of environment of a poor refugee community in the Bronx, nature consisted of, I had a dog, an English Cocker Spaniel. My father bred tropical fish for a local pet store. And I had an injured critter hospital.
All right.
So if there was anything that you came across in the street, a pigeon with a broken wing or a baby that fell out of the nest, it came home, much to my mother's chagrin and much to my father's delight. That was nature. And it wasn't until I met my husband-to-be that I actually visited a Forever Wild forest in Catskills, which is a mountain range in the middle of New York. And this is a forest that to this day is still forever wild. And to start with, that's an interesting kind of forest to visit, a forest that is not managed for timber. It's only the trails are kept free and clear, and the rest of it is not managed at all.
So was that your first forest experience?
Completely.
And how did it make you feel?
Overwhelmed. I felt all this energy. I put my arms around Quercus rubra, a red oak. I laid down on the floor with my back against the ground. And looked up at this cathedral above me. It was awesome. And I found my personal north. That was the beginning of my tree career, really, was this journey to the Catskills. Catskills is anglicized for the Dutch Katerskill, because remember, New York was founded, clearly this entire indigenous community that lived there didn't exist. It was founded by the Dutch. And there's all these Dutch place names. And the Catskills continues to have this Dutch place name, which is Caterskill, and kill in Dutch is a stream. There were all these streams.
So you had this amazing, literally forest bathing experience and an awakening within you. What did you do then?
I started studying. Clearly, this was 1976. There was no urban forestry program. So you just kind of study whatever, botany, horticulture, landscape design. Urban forestry was already the urban forest. This name started in Canada with a professor that was teaching in Toronto. And he came up with this name, the urban forest. And of course, this is an oxymoron. The USDA Forest Service started a program called RELEAF, RELEAF. And this focused on the grassroots. And through people that I was meeting and an interest in having volunteers who had some background come in and assist, I was able to get involved with this program. At the New York State level, I helped author the program for New York State. And when the program actually came on board, I ran it in New York City for over a decade.
So when was this? Was this in the 1980s?
This was in the late 80s throughout the 90s.
And what was the objective of the RELEAF project?
The objective was to get citizens involved with their urban forest, understanding that the urban forest belongs to everybody. Doesn't belong to the people who manage it. It doesn't belong to the government. It belongs to everybody. No matter what your profession is, when you go home at night, you're a citizen. You own a piece of that urban forest that you are living in.
And how did you reach the citizens?
There were all kinds of programs and initiatives. New York City always had a grounds up, a bottom up approach to lots of things. And we already had the early beginnings of block associations, community organizations. And so it was really easy to go into these block associations and start talking to people, connecting them with their green space, the trees on their street. How do you make it better? What can you do? What can we offer? And of course, in the 90s, in 1996, we ended up with Asian longhorn beetle. That first infestation, the second one in Chicago. But you know, the value in a disaster is you can turn it into a very positive thing. And people were very concerned about the beetle. And with the backing and support of the USDA Forest Service, I developed an Asian longhorn beetle public outreach program for New York City.
Going back a step, when you started out with your project and you went to the community centres and you spoke to citizens, were people at that time really aware of their urban forest? Did they feel that it was part of their lives, or did you find a whole range of different views from people who just never noticed trees, to others who are passionate about taking care of their street trees?
It's the whole range. And there are some people who will never be inspired. And that's okay.
Yes.
You can't reach everybody. You take advantage of whatever teachable moment comes your way. And you try to make whatever connections you can make. And I was really lucky to have this connection, this really strong connection with my USDA Forest Service urban forester. Every state in the United States gets an urban forester from the federal government. And these programs are their joint programs between the federal government and the state government, because the Fed cannot come in except through the state partner agency, which in New York State was the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. And I had an excellent working relationship with that agency. And through my federal urban forester, who was a really wonderful woman who came from Durham, New Hampshire, she was the next door neighbor of Alex Shigo. And between her and Alex, one day she came to me and she said, I've been talking to Alex about you. We've decided you would make a wonderful arborist. That was how I actually started exploring becoming an arborist, through these connections of running these programs for the federal and state government, going as much beyond what their idea of what the program could do. I mean, connecting professionals with citizens. Asian longhorn beetle, as disastrous as it was in a way a blessing, because it enabled us to reach out to many more people who saw that trees were being cut down, whole neighborhoods were being deforested, denuded from something green, sort of green, to pure gray.
Tell us about how the community responded and what you actually enabled them to do to make it better.
Well, the whole idea of the public outreach program was to develop material that citizens could understand to help them look for the beetle, remembering that the first time a beetle was found was not by a professional. It was found by a citizen who saw holes in his maple tree that lived on his street. It was a public tree. And he thought somebody was vandalizing his maple tree. So he decided to play sleuth. And instead of finding a who, he found a what. And he caught the what in a jar. He put it in his freezer and he started calling. I have this giant bug. And it was a giant bug.
Yeah, because they're massive, aren't they?
They are massive. They are exquisite. Isn't it a pity they didn't ask to be imported into New York City? And so, one thing led to another. This beetle was identified. There was some research done, some investigation. They found out where it came from, what it was exactly. And that was the beginning of the war.
And how long did the war last?
Even though it doesn't go on officially, it still goes on, because you can't have a beetle like this, where almost every host species is what you would plant in an urban environment. That's how big the list is. You can't have an opportunistic insect like this with a climate range from northern Mexico to southern Canada and think you're going to get rid of this overnight. They're not doing surveys anymore, but I can guarantee you that somewhere in the Northeast, in the Midwest, there are still populations of this beetle waiting to be discovered. And so we did all kinds of things. We involved all the botanical gardens, all of the community organizations in the quarantine zones. I and the University of Vermont developed a Beetle Buster toolbox with a slideshow, script, all kinds of touchy-feely things, beetles, pinned beetles, frass, kiln-dried infested wood, larvae, and we did a train the trainer program with the USDA Forest Service. and myself and other people from Relief, training communities, people in communities who were willing to support training their community.
See, that's really powerful, isn't it? When it comes from a member of the community to other members of that community rather than this top-down approach from scientists.
So you had people who were in the community, organizations that already existed in the community and had a stable network. They got a toolbox, they got a T-shirt funded by our utility company, Con Edison. We gave away 25 of these. Con Edison paid for another 50 to go into schools. We had an invasive species curriculum that was required. Well, ready-made, Asian longhorn beetle. So I traveled around the state doing lectures to junior highs and high schools about Asian longhorn beetle with my little traveling beetle buster toolbox.
I bet the children loved that, didn't they?
They adored it. They adored it, especially all these touchy-feely things. They could look at a beetle, they could look at the frass, they could handle the wood, and a script show, a slideshow rather, that would work for young adults and adults. And so we had beetle busters all over the state. The kids loved that they became, by taking the training, they became official beetle busters. We did a program with the Girl Scouts. For every one of the first 25 toolboxes, we did a program with Girl Scouts in Brooklyn and Queens in the quarantine zones to create host species herbarium. So the botanical gardens donated classroom space and materials. The Girl Scouts, they created this patch program with me. They let me design the patch. And between the two boroughs, we created 25 herbarium for each of the 25 first toolboxes.
How fantastic.
Yes. And in addition to doing that, the Girl Scouts took material that we had developed and went out in the street on Saturday and Sunday into these quarantine communities, handing out literature. Before I moved away from New York, my phone number was in the quarantine brochure that everybody received, and everybody in New York got one, thanks to Con Edison, the utility company. What they did was they used it as a bill stuffer. So this quarantine brochure was in every single Con Edison bill. This went to millions of New Yorkers.
So people could then know what they've got to look for and report it, and then a tree would be felled.
Correct. And the idea was that you didn't ask people to go around all of New York City looking at trees. You wanted them to look at the trees they were intimate with. So the tree that sits in front of their house, the tree they go past on their way to the supermarket or walking the dog or on their way to the subway in the morning. Those are the trees you want them to connect to and survey. And before I moved, I would still get phone calls. Oh, I have a question about a tree. Sure. It didn't matter that it wasn't about the beetle. It mattered that you kept the brochure and that you have a question about a tree and you're calling me. Well, isn't that great?
It is, because you sparked love for trees.
Yes.
And so you must have been so busy. Your phone must have been off the hook.
Yes. Yes. During the height of this infestation, we were all consumed. We had a professional and citizen conference hosted by Con Edison. We taught citizens and professionals how you survey for the beetle. It was unfortunate that there was a storm that day. We couldn't do it in the park that we planned to, but we constructed inside this auditorium fake situations where you would go looking for the beetle. It was absolutely fantastic. The press was there, people from politicians were there, people from all over were there. We broke them into little teams. We went looking, surveying, searching for these little things put into these branches and of signs of the beetle, frass, holes, egg sites. It was incredible. All funded by Con Edison. Lunch, breaks.
Following the eradication, or well, not the near eradication and the felling, obviously there needed to be a lot of planting. So did Relief work with the citizens to do the replanting?
We did this in the neighborhood that was hit the hardest, and that was Greenpoint. We did a survey with the community of trees that remained, and that was funded by the Forest Service. And I and other professionals sat with the Parks Department and came up with a specification for what we expected in the way of replacement tree material. We were not going to accept business as usual. We wanted what satisfied our criteria, trees that were planted, that came in a bowl at grade, not too deep in the bowl, which is more the norm than not.
Did people get involved with choosing the species and planting them?
No, the people didn't do it because in a city, you have a minimal requirement of size. And for the most part, this is really too heavy for citizens to manage well. It's one thing if you can work with small material, if you can work with bare root, but we were not able to do that. So it had to be planting. The Parks Department put out a bid. It was bid on by contractors. So it was done by contractors, but with lots of oversight from the professional community that wrote the specifications for the selection and the planting and the establishment.
So talking about the establishment, by now the community have been enlightened to how important trees are and what they mean to them. So did they get involved with the watering?
They didn't get involved with the watering for that, but it's really rewarding that Greenpoint has a tree corps. Yeah. And they go out and they mulch tree areas. They water when there's droughty conditions, because it's only newly planted trees that get the establishment protocol if somebody's watching. Just because it's in the contract doesn't mean it's going to happen. So an involved community, an informed community that cares about their trees, that's what you want. Because if it's not happening, they're going to raise some noise.
That's what we need.
Yes.
You did that for 10 years. What next?
At the same time, I was working as a consulting arborist. I became an arborist. It didn't last for that long because I developed a ventral hernia. And so I was encouraged by colleagues who were consulting arborists that I had the wherewithal to be a consulting arborist. And so I started working on large public infrastructure projects, initially as a subcontractor of a subcontractor, and then working directly as a subcontractor, and developing building with trees strategies as I worked more and more on the design phase of a design and build rather than the build phase. And this was facilitated by friends and colleagues who worked for government, who were in the right position to incorporate me into the writing of specifications, which I learned how to do as an urban forester. This is not a skill that most consulting arborists have. And so I was able to bring the skills of an urban forester into that professional perspective and actually review, edit, and author specifications.
So one of the specifications that you wrote was building with trees?
Well, the whole concept I called building with trees. And that concept is you can't stop spatial development in a city. This would be a fantasy to think of that, to dream of that. No, the idea is you have to do spatial development from an ecological design perspective, a do no harm to the environment perspective. How? How do you do that? Construction has really gone a long way in terms of procedure and methodology, but it's usually only applied to hardscape. For example, you're working on a highway, you're installing sewage pipe, and how are you going to get the sewage pipe across an entrance or an exit lane? Well, there's all these strategies that construction people have for getting this without getting this from one side of the entry lane to another side without destroying the road. Well, hell, why not use the same methodology for getting under roots of trees? That means you have to take down less trees.
Still can be a challenge.
Well, it depends, you know. I worked on a really big project, on the design part of that project. And that project was rebuilding a sewage plant that was not in compliance and moving the sewage to a sewage treatment plant, which was miles and miles away. There was a hookup point at the Verrazano Bridge, so it was laying pipe all the way along the highway and through the streets of these communities in Brooklyn to move that sewage from the Coney Island sewage plant to the Verrazano Bridge hookup. This miles and miles, over 1,000 trees in arterial and street landscape. Well, that means a lot of takedowns. And so New York City does not do tree for tree to replace takedowns. It does what's called a basal replacement formula. That means really wood for wood. So there is a formula that you use to calculate what the wood in a tree is. Now, this clearly predated iTree. So there was no ecosystem services assessment, but using a basal replacement formula, if you've got a Quercus phellos, a willow oak, and it's in excellent condition, and it has a diameter of greater than 3 feet, well, if you think you're going to take down this tree for free, you are mistaken. A tree of such consequence is tens of thousands of dollars. So by the time I finished the inventory and calculated all the basal replacements based on condition and species, hundreds of thousands of dollars. well, what can we do? It was like, well, okay, let's look at it. What can we do? And that's where you can open the door to a discussion about different ways of laying out the pipe. What can we do that will keep many more trees standing? Sure, if the tree is in poor condition, if it's dying, you're going to remove that tree. You're not going to try to save that tree. But if trees are good, or if they're excellent, you're going to do everything you can to protect, preserve, and retain those trees.
Especially when you can talk money.
Yeah.
Because that will wake up the minds of some of the design team like nothing else.
Correct.
Because they may not have been on one of your Marvellous Citizens programs. They may not be touched by the vision of a tree, but you talk figures. That's why I'm a big fan of quantifying one way or the other by whatever means.
Correct. Whatever valuation mechanisms you have in place, they have to recognize that a 75-year-old oak that is in excellent condition has just started on the path of maturity, especially if it's in the white group. And so now you have to really value that tree for the species that it is, the longevity it can attain, and the condition that it's in. Using the diameter and these formulas, whether it's wood for wood or basil, or I don't care what you do, but it certainly isn't one for one.
No, I mean, that's something we're doing the same in the UK, and there are various methods. There's a financial valuation using CAVAT. Presumably you were using CTLA, were you, the Basel method?
Yes. CTLA you use for the condition, but you don't use it to start the valuation of the tree. That has to be basal, well, whatever you use. We used basal replacement. But then on top of that, now you're going to mitigate that with what your condition rating is, running that through CTLA. But you're still not doing ecosystem services, because neither CTLA or CAVAT or Koch or any of the other formulas, Helliwell, or every country's got one, none of them consider ecosystem services. And in this day and age, you have to include that.
I agree, and I am in my daily work with my urban developments, and also canopy cover, which is a fairly simple assessment, a two-dimensional canopy cover, what's there at the moment in a given site, and calculating what's staying, what's going, and look at when can you achieve year equivalents with new planting. And the use of iTree is just beginning on a small scale. But I think we have to look really holistically about the services that the trees are providing.
Correct.
I think we're at a really exciting time for that.
I agree with you.
Yeah, and policies are being developed in London. We've got the London Plan, which has just been brought out with a policy. You know, you've got to consider a method of valuation of the trees. So everybody's waking up to that, and some people are lagging behind in industry. But when you start quantifying things and you can measure it, then people really start to sit up and take notice.
Well, if you really want to go out on a walk, or if you're stuck on a cruise liner in New York, and if it's people we can't see while in this virtual reality, you may as well download an episode of Archery Lady Talks. Marvellous, yes. Marvellous idea.
Every city that's involved in a city or canton that's involved in the Swiss iTree project has to create two products. One is really about communicating what you've learned, and the other is applying what you've learned. And two cities are focused on changing the approach to how you value a tree. Because here it's as typical as in most places. Trees are valued using the Swiss method for damage. And it's a procedure that's accepted in the courts. But this business as usual, it doesn't work anymore.
No, it doesn't.
Trees are undervalued routinely, and that's not okay. And now that there is iTree Echo here in Switzerland, you can easily value a tree and incorporate iTree Echo into that inventory strategy and assessment.
Yes, it's going to make a massive difference. So we've skipped over now to Switzerland. You left the USA for Switzerland fairly recently?
8 years ago. I left in 2012. That's when I retired. And unfortunately, my husband and I were supposed to move here. That was the plan. And unfortunately, he passed away just before I retired. He had inherited the house he grew up in. I had to come. You can't just leave a house. And so I came here and I was kind of, do I really want to move to Switzerland by myself? I already had a bit of experience here. Al and I worked on an Alp for 15 years, so I knew a bit about the Swiss hinterland and cultural things about Switzerland. I went in the garden, and Al and I really had remade the garden from a real woody plant perspective. And it was a bit wild, and it was a wonderful garden. And when I went in the garden, I just said, well, I can't really leave the garden. You know, I never had a garden before. And so much love went into this garden that I decided to move. And so, took me a half a year to put my act together. And I moved here in October of 2012.
In terms of knowledge and love of trees, is that universal within Switzerland and the USA, or is it patchy and diverse?
First of all, urban forestry didn't exist here. It only sort of exists. There is no study of urban forestry. That's brand new. We are doing it as we speak.
Are there tree officers or urban foresters within local government in Switzerland?
No. The people that are doing the management either study gardening, which leaves a bit to be desired, because what's missing is a real fundamental understanding of soil, hydrology, and these two things in relation to the tree and the tree's roots. When that's missing from the thought process is incomplete. Swiss people do love their forests, but those are forests. And it's through the work that we're doing now that people are really starting to learn about their urban trees, what they are, what they're not getting, the stresses, their origins, and what they need. And it's my biggest issue with ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are a one-way street. What is the tree doing for me? Well, you know what? The reality is your tree can't do for you unless you do for your tree. And so that's my agenda.
And what about influencing government and local government to make urban foresters a necessary post in each municipality? Well,
the iTree project has really opened the door into this. In New York, I was a real activist, not just with the civil rights movement and not just with Vietnam, but also when it came to urban trees and and green space in general. We had many things going on that did not really consider the value of things green. For example, when Giuliani was mayor, there were all these community gardens. They were abandoned land that the city owned, and they were filled with rubble and garbage, and there was nothing wholesome or holistic about these empty lots. And communities took them over, cleaned them up, planted them, and made them into little oases. And that started improving the community. And so what did Giuliani do? He decided the city could benefit from this by bulldozing the garden.
What?
Mm-hmm, in the middle of the night.
Really?
And then turning it over to a developer because now it was desirable.
So you lift the spirits of a community. You potentially raise its property value because they've got a lovely community garden and everybody's more relaxed and benefiting from green space. So there's more money to be made. What on earth happened next?
Well, New Yorkers, we don't sit down or lay down for this kind of thing. We took action. We developed a strategy. We got the New York State District Attorney involved. He went to bat for us. We did all kinds of protests in the street. Pete Seeger, who was a real community gardening fan, he joined with his sons. We had all kinds of activism taking place, protecting the gardens. People would blockade the fences, stopping the bulldozers, and then the New York State District Attorney stopped it once and for all.
But how many gardens were lost in the meantime?
I honestly don't remember, but there were quite a few that were bulldozed until he put a stop to it. He assigned us 2 attorneys, so we had a direct liaison with the district attorney's office in New York State, and that was the end of gardens being bulldozed. So it's this kind of activism. It was me testifying over and over again at City Hall during the Parks Department reviews as to what was really going on in the streets, the real reality of things. And with the full support of, I no longer was involved with New York Relief, but all of the professionals that were involved with Relief, we started our own not-for-profit called New York City Root Zone. This was an educational, it's a landscape professional educational organization. And we were all kinds of consulting arborists, landscape architects, horticulturists, people who really cared about trees and who really took exception with the way in which they were being managed by the New York City Parks Department. And we challenged everything that was anti-tree.
Wow, what a powerhouse.
Yes.
That's really inspirational.
Yeah, that's what you have to do. You have to stand up. You can't accept things like that are going on, that went on in Sheffield, just happened in Surrey. You have to stand up and say, no, we're not taking this.
We are producing an episode in May about Sheffield, and it's going to be called And Now for the Good News.
Great.
Because there are some great initiatives taking place now in Sheffield, out of much pain and suffering. So unbelievable, shocking situation. But there's good stuff happening. So check that out in May. So you bring that same incredible dynamism and passion and ingenuity here in Switzerland.
Yes. And they know. They've been read the Riot Act. And so fortunately, there is a really wonderful young man who was part of the municipal entity, what is called in German the Stadtgärtnerei, and he is really open to new ideas and new approaches to doing things. And we've developed the Lucerne iTree projects together. So the main one is with a 100-plus-year-old Tilia platyphyllos that is in severe decline. It's a very prominent tree on the Lucerne landscape. And why is it in decline? Because it's been mismanaged into decline. Instead of protecting this tree, which is protected by law, this tree, its critical root zone, has been ripped apart through all kinds of installations, gas lines, electric lines, water lines, a sewage outlet from a tourist boat. All of that is within this tree's critical root zone. In addition, soil that's no longer soil, it's basically cement, compacted into oblivion, covered with geotextile fabric and a whole bunch of stones with all kinds of things driving over it, stored inside it, excavators, trucks, bicycles, people's dogs visiting it relentlessly. And I just said no and developed a soil root restoration, reinvigoration program, which was accepted completely. And we're in the middle of that. We already did the first steps of soil and root restoration and invigoration. In a couple of weeks, we're going to do a radial trenching throughout the entire critical root zone. It's now all the geotextile is gone. The stones are gone. We did a compost tea, soil drench, because of thoughtless pruning.
Well, it's thoughtless pruning. That's the word to use. But if you haven't got an urban forester in the local authority, and if you don't have people monitoring and advising, then that needs to change. And maybe, hopefully, the work that you're doing with others will set a movement in Switzerland.
Well, this progressed into something else. Mm-hmm. And so I'm now a consultant for the department, and they have shared with me all of their management documents, which I have translated and have started commenting on, making sure that nobody is offended by my exploration and investigation and comments. Mm-hmm. And so there's all kinds of things that they need to review, revisit, and revitalize, because the concepts that you're using are from another time and another era. And that kind of business as usual, it won't work anymore.
No, and we haven't got time to muck about.
No, we're out of time. And so the fact that this has moved into that, and this colleague of mine who was really the door opener for that to happen, he said to me, once we're doing this and once it's part of Lucerne's strategy, then it's Swiss. Then we can take it somewhere else.
I wonder, Naomi, what is your dream scenario?
That Switzerland really embraces urban forestry as an essential part of the urban ecosystem, that there is a real understanding of the importance of the urban forest, that it belongs to everybody, and that trees and the landscapes they populate are an essential ingredient in quality of life.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Naomi Zurcher. It's been an absolute privilege to speak to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great evening.
Hit the subscribe button to guarantee you don't miss an episode, and you can follow us on
Twitter at the Tree Lady 67.
Instagram, Tree Lady Talks,
Facebook, Sharon Hosgood Associates.
or send an email to noel@treeladytalks.co.uk. Ooh, I tell you what, if Naomi Zurcher asked me to sign up to try and get rid of the Asian longhorn beetle, I would be straight there. I mean, she's just so... It's hard to say it's hard to say why people connect with you, but honestly, that was just such a beautiful thing to listen to. And now she's in Switzerland doing her thing. I mean, look out the Swiss, because you've really got somebody on your hands there who's going to sort you out. Good for her. I thought that was beautiful.
And she's kind of a neat segue to our next episode, which is women in arboriculture.
This is very true. We're having a coffee morning, aren't we?
We are.
Get the espressos ready.
Courtesy of the Arboricultural Association, where we dropped in and had a chat with some women in ARB. And we're also interviewing a career changer, a tree surgeon, a tree consultant, a tree officer, and some important women in the industry.
Fantastic. Well, I really look forward to that. But in the meantime, it's enough for me to say goodbye and for you to say goodbye. How about that?
Goodbye from him.
Goodbye from me. Thank you. Good night.
Bye.
And I just thought I'd let you in on the secret. We've got a new donkey. Donkey? Thank you.